Okay, so I'm going to start out with an opening about my moral argument for veganism, and then we're going to go through the debate. I have 6 different points that I want to make to open up, each describing a certain aspect of the argument for veganism. So my first contention is that unjustifiably harming animals is wrong. Morality is ultimately an expression of well-being. Any attempts to develop morality through some other method must ultimately draw on well-being because well-being is the only thing that we can sensibly value. In addition, both animals and humans have a capacity for happiness and pain. Therefore, a moral framework based on well-being must value both humans and animals. Finally, self-awareness does not separate humans and animals morally. This is because self-awareness does not affect whether animals can feel pain and pleasure. Inflicting pain is always wrong, and self-awareness is an arbitrary boundary that has nothing to do with well-being. Therefore, we must avoid harming animals just as we would avoid harming humans. Contention 2 is that eating meat harms animals. First, humans should practice moral consistency. This is because if we are morally inconsistent, then almost anything can be morally justified as an exception to some rule. For example, if I say that Jews have a lower moral value than Aryans, then I've just justified the Holocaust, which is obviously bad for well-being, by being morally inconsistent about the value of life. And prematurely killing humans is wrong. If a person falls into a coma, we don't then say, okay, let's kill him and study his organs. He won't feel it anyway, no harm done. Therefore, to be morally consistent, we must conclude that prematurely killing animals is just as wrong as killing humans. Contention 3 is that eating animal products such as milk harms animals. I can't go through every single animal product, so I will focus on milk. In order to produce milk from a cow, the cow must be forcefully impregnated, then separated from her child so that the milk can be extracted for human use. Under no conditions will we say that forcefully impregnating humans is justified. It is the equivalent of rape, which does not meet the criterion of well-being. Therefore, to be morally consistent, we must conclude that raising cows for their milk is wrong. Similar logic applies to most other animal products, and therefore it is immoral to consume those as well. Contention 4 is that the ideal farm will never be a reality for most animals. There currently exists a high demand for meat and animal products, especially in developed countries such as the USA that have money to spend on those products. Factory farms are the way that corporations meet this incredible demand. Without factory farms, it would be impossible to produce the quantity of meat and animal products that exists today. And factory farms are extremely harmful to animals. They involve putting animals in tiny cages where they can barely move, force feeding them, and then killing them. In the US, chickens have their throats cut off by a mechanical blade while they're still conscious. So by eating meat and animal products, we are perpetuating this immoral factory farm practice. Contention 5 is that going vegan mitigates harms to animals. Going vegan decreases the demand for meat and animal products that I previously described because there are fewer people willing to buy them. If the demand for meat and animal products decreases, then production of those products will decrease to match. If the demand for meat and animal products decreases, there will also be less of a necessity to use reprehensible factory farming techniques to meet that high demand. As such, every person has a moral obligation to be a vegan and reduce the harms to animals. And my final contention is that there are no valid justifications for eating meat and animal products. Vegan diets are perfectly healthy, and therefore there is no harm to humans in switching to them. And finally, we must weigh moral impacts against each other to decide what is moral. As such, pro must provide a moral impact that outweighs the harms I've presented to justify not being a vegan.
Well, I'm not here today to try and justify not being vegan, or I'm here to explore the arguments. I'm hoping that we can come to a kind of a really coherent argument for veganism that people can consider, right?
Sure.
So I'm not here to. My intention isn't to dissuade anybody. It's to challenge you to try and firm up your argument, as it were, right? Because I have no problem if people want to be vegans. That's great. But I sometimes find that the rationale a little strange. And I am interested in moralism. So I'm going to take these a little bit one at a time in kind of semi-random order, rather than just hit all your points and try to respond. That gets kind of confusing. So let's start up with number one, because I think it kind of underpins a lot of the other things that it has to do with saying unjustifiably harming animals is wrong. So that begs the question, what justifies harming something else or another animal or a person or whatever? What is the moral precept on which you balance whether or not your actions are justifiable?
Yeah. So the reason I put the word unjustifiably there is because often the counter argument to veganism is to say something like, well, eating meat tastes good, and therefore, we can harm animals in order to reach that end, which we think is moral. So I'm saying, absent any benefits, harming animals is wrong. So that's what I mean by unjustifiably. And that's my final argument, is basically saying there isn't any justification that outweighs the harms to animals, and therefore it's wrong to inflict those harms.
What about survival?
What do you mean by that?
Let's say I'm stranded on a mountaintop and there's a dead goat there. I don't have other food available. Is eating the goat immoral?
No. Well, the issue with that is that it's an edge case. So there's an edge case to almost every moral argument, but the issue with that is that that's not the world that we live in today. So if you, for example, were to go vegan, you're not stranded on a desert island with a dead goat next to you. So by going to the store, for example, and buying meat, you're telling the people who are creating that meat, hey, I want this meat. Can you please keep making more of it? Which motivates them to continue producing that meat through these immoral practices that I've described. So yes, if you were stranded on a desert island and there was a dead goat, of course you can eat it. But that's just not the world we live in.
That's not the world we live in. Well, I think it is. I mean, all moral systems really should be principles and guidelines by which you can make decisions in your life in whatever circumstances you happen to find yourself in. Yeah. So if you want to limit veganism to say only people who live in advanced industrial societies who have available to mass market commercial food should abstain from meat, that's one set of vegan principles, right? It's another to say it is strictly, there are no justifications by which you should consume animal products, right? Those are two different moral precepts. And so I think they get conflated here, and I'm trying to figure out which one you're advocating for. Is veganism limited to a modern industrial society, or is veganism a foundational moral principle having to do with, sort of imposing our needs over the needs of other creatures?
Okay, so I think that whether or not veganism is a good idea just depends on the situation you're in. So I agree with you that obviously in an advanced industrialized society like the USA, going vegan would make sense. If you're in a place where the only option to eat food is animals, and I don't know any specific places like that, but I'm sure those places exist. So in that kind of place, that would be, like I said, that would be a justification for eating animals, because the first argument I made is if it's unjustifiable, we shouldn't do it. But if you need that for survival, yes, that would be a justification.
Okay, so survival is a valid justification for eating other animals.
Right.
Okay, and so the principle by which your veganism exists is one in which that if the survival is not impinged, then it's not the case. However, you don't feel sort of pleasure and enjoyment rises to the moral weight necessary to justify that kind of harm.
I don't think pleasure in itself does. No.
No. Okay. All right. What about cultural traditions?
Cultural traditions.
Yeah. So like Inuit people up in Alaska, they hunt whales and they hunt a lot of animals. Now, generally they need it for survival, but theoretically they could have everything. They could abandon that way of life and have everything imported. It would completely change their culture to do so. Is the cultural tradition and the traditional way of life in the environment that they grew up in enough to justify those kinds of hunting practices if it is theoretically possible that they could, at some extra expense and difficulty and the sacrifice of their normal way of life, to import vegetable products into that environment?
Well, that would require a pretty extensive analysis on the effects of the well-being of the people to abandon this cultural tradition. So if it's an extremely deep-seated tradition and abandoning it would cause, like, I don't know, mass depression or something, then that probably wouldn't be justified. But I'm guessing that over the course of multiple generations, if we phased out the practice of eating meat in those places, and we kind of they're I don't know very much about their culture. So if their culture is like entirely based on eating meat or hunting animals, then that's a separate issue. But if that's just one facet of a larger cultural tradition, for example, then we can phase out that part of it while maintaining the rest of the culture without any significant harm to those people that would outweigh the harm to the animals that are being hunted.
Mm-hmm. How about medicinal products?
What's one example of that?
Vaccines. A lot of vaccines, say the flu vaccine, is incubated inside of chicken eggs in order to culture the vaccine. It's an effective way to do that. And there aren't a lot of sort of great alternatives. I'm sure probably something exists, but and there's a lot of other medical products where animal proteins or fats are used as part of the matrix in which the cultures grow, or are part of the serum value that makes the product work.
Yeah. I would put that under the same umbrella as the survival topic, which we discussed earlier, saying that if it's important to the health of people to have this vaccine, for example, if we want to stop people from getting tetanus, that would obviously be a justification for using, for example, eggs in order to create that vaccine.
Mm-hmm. What do you think is the moral underpinning of the obligation not to cause harm to other living creatures? To me, it is implicit that there's a social cohesion benefit. My theory of morality is that it exists for the purpose of human social interaction, because we're a species that lives and dies by our social cooperation. So moral systems were developed in order to allow us to live together in groups harmoniously and effectively. And that's sort of the underpinning of moral systems. So as a moral test, you can say, look, does this help me live in a more harmonious society or not? When it comes to other species and other animals, there are some situations where that makes sense. If you have horses or dogs or cats or things like that, or even farm animals, there are ways in which you can treat them that lead to a more harmonious and sort of effective cooperation, and ways that you can treat them that don't, right? So I can see under that justification. So, but what is the underpinning of moral value that leads you to think that it is wrong to harm those who are not part of your social group?
Okay. So the first thing I'm going to bring up, I'm not an expert on this, but I'm going to start out with the is-ought problem. So I think that saying something is moral because that's how we've evolved to act doesn't really make any sense. So if we say, for example, that morality was developed in order to increase social cohesion, it's like, okay, but we haven't figured out why social cohesion is good. So there's no reason to say that that's the way we have to live. We also evolved to kill our stepchildren, but that doesn't mean that that's a moral action.
What do you mean we evolved to kill our stepchildren?
That's something that over time we evolved to do. We have like an innate desire to do that.
I've never noticed one.
Do you have any stepchildren?
I don't, but I know people who do. In fact, I know people who have adopted children, and they tend to love them quite a lot. I've never known that to be a common theme in human society, to want to murder your stepchildren.
Okay, so maybe not that example, but there are certain things that we've evolved to want to do. That doesn't necessarily mean they're right. So
right,
I think,
but evolution isn't what I'm talking about. Evolution develops in a way that sometimes is very rational, right? But as human beings, we have a kind of higher level of rationality that we can employ in our social relationships, right? That goes beyond a little just what we desire. So we might, desire. It's commonly understood. This is where moral challenges come from. We might desire to, say, sleep with our neighbor's wife or something, right? But we know that would cause a lot of problems. Like our neighbor would be very angry with us and might come and try to attack us. And we don't want our neighbor sleeping with our wives, right? So we make an agreement. I will sleep with your wife, you don't sleep with mine, right? And so these are kind of social contracts that we make and arrangements that we put together in order to benefit everybody in the society and make it more harmonious and successful, right? Because by ourselves, we don't really stand much of a chance. Some people as hermits can get around, but human society wouldn't advance very far, right? So these are pretty rational. You can sort of underpin them from a pragmatic point of view and a social cohesion. Even the idea, I mean, once upon a time, fighting with other tribes was not considered an immoral act because it was either necessary for the competition of resources or whatever the case. But we actually came to realize that kind of intertribal violence was actually not helpful for us in most situations ultimately, and the cooperation is a more useful paradigm. So we shift to a moral idea of globalism and multiculturalism and things like that, because we realize there's a lot of benefits to these kinds of behaviors for us as a society and as a people, right? And even with veganism, you know, there's probably some areas in which we can point to and say, hey, there are some advantages for some percentage of people to pursue veganism, or to not hunt, or, you know, various other kinds of behaviors, right? But we then set up sort of a set of restrictions to which point they become harmful or not harmful, and we make moral rules based on those ideas. But as a broad principle that everybody should follow, that isn't necessarily supported by all activities. Like, so if everybody wanted to go hunting, of course, that would be destructive to the environment, and nobody would be able to go hunting anymore. So you get a resource of the commons kind of a situation, and you resolve it by saying, well, look, we'll determine how many people can go hunting, and then those people who are willing to invest the most resources in using that activity are the ones who are allowed to go do it. That seems a rational way to decide that situation. But for instance, I mean, you know, for me to say, hey, it is wrong for me to, I don't know, you know, shoot the snake that has crawled up onto under my porch, right? Well, I don't really like the snake there, and, you know, the snake likes being there. We have a dispute. We can't communicate or come to some sort of rational agreement. So it's my porch, so I'm more powerful. I'm going to get rid of the snake. So at what point, what is immoral about these actions, right? You know, and what's the underpinning? Is it simply empathy? If you feel empathy, you shouldn't do it. Or, you know, that's the thing. Is it, so the social dynamic has a thing that it is good for our survival. It's good for us as individuals. It's good for us collectively, and so therefore it is useful, a good idea to do it, right? So what is it that underpins the idea that we should not harm other creatures, any other sentient creatures?
Okay, so I think the first thing that I'm going to point out is, I don't know if you've read The Moral Landscape by Sam Harris, no. But I'm noticing a similar issue to what is in that book, which is that you're implicitly assuming a certain thing to be good, which I think is the advancement of society or the survival of our species. But in order to derive,
good for us, right? I'm a moral subjectivist, so I think morals always come from our desires and a rational thought. Like, these two things together form our moral systems and the circumstances in which we find ourselves. So we have a natural self-interest. I certainly do, in my survival and my pleasure, things like that, right? So those are goals that arrive. Our desires form goals. Then our reason forms a means in which to achieve those goals, right?
Okay, so the question is, why is meeting those goals a good thing? That hasn't been established, which is why I'm using the first principle of well-being as the way that we can develop morality. Because we can't just assume that everything we have a goal to accomplish is moral to accomplish. Because I can have a goal to do anything. Hitler had a goal to take over the world and kill all the Jews. That didn't make it moral. So we have to look to some kind of base principle that we can all accept. It's an axiom of morality. And the one that I'm proposing is well-being. Because what I said in the first argument is any conception of morality must ultimately draw on well-being. For example, what you're talking about with hunting. Why is preserving the resources good? Is it just because resources are good in general, or is it because humans use them in order to survive?
It's because we like them.
Right, and that's because they increase our well-being to possess them. Because, for example, we can eat them, which increases our survival. We aren't in pain as we die, and we can perpetuate our species. Why is benefiting society good? Because it makes people feel good. It increases happiness and it decreases pain. So if you try to propose any moral framework, ultimately you will be implicitly drawing on the conception of well-being, because that's the only thing that you can intelligibly value. And if we start from that framework, then we can come up with other moral ideas that make more sense. For example, it would advance society if we killed everyone with like some genetic disorder, because then we could wipe out those disorders. We wouldn't have that issue anymore. But obviously, we can't just kill all those people.
I disagree that would logically follow. But
okay, but my point is, when we use well-being first and we say let's maximize well-being, then we can reach other conclusions that wouldn't be attainable by other moral frameworks.
So what if our well-being involves eating animals?
Well, we can't only consider our well-being. The well-being of animals is of similar value. That's what I said in my
Why should it be of similar value to us?
Because first of all, why shouldn't it be a similar value to us? Because both animals and humans have brains. Both animals and humans are capable of feeling both pleasure and pain. And like I said in my first contention, when you talk about the problem of self-awareness, what does self-awareness have to do with whether the well-being of an animal is important? They're still going to feel pain whether they have metacognition or not. So there's no reason that we draw that bright line and say, okay, if you're self-aware, then you matter. If you're not self-aware, then you don't. It doesn't make any sense.
So here's a problem. So this is, I mean, to me, it's an appeal to empathy, right? It's saying that you should have a moral empathy for other creatures that are maybe not part of your society directly, but are like you in some biological sense, right? But I think the problem extends that then veganism becomes a problem is you're killing plants, you're eating plants, you're consuming them, you're destroying their lives. They have reactionary systems that react to pain. They don't like being destroyed. They have biological mechanisms that try to ensure their survival and perpetuation as a species. And yet we're going around, should I have empathy for them as well? In which case I can't eat anything, right? Which leaves me to starve to death, right? So why are plants less worthy of our empathy than animals in this case? And furthermore, the very growing of plants, the very nature of being a human being, occupying a home, is displacing other animals, causing them pain and distress, destroying their environments, creating situations in which they might starve and die. By getting rid of farms that raise animals, we'd have to be abandoning those animals and leaving them to starve and die and suffer, which I suppose is moot compared to killing them. So that's kind of a no-go there. But generally speaking, our survival on the planet is a competition for resources inherently. So anything that we do in order to perpetuate our survival in species is going to impact and degrade the survival of other animals and species, cause them harm and distress. We kill lots of animals with our cars. We kill lots of animals by building roadways. We kill animals by creating power plants and putting up dams, by digging into the earth, by putting pollution into the sky. Nearly anything and everything that we can possibly do is going to have some kind of a significant impact on animals, especially when you justify an industrial society as being one capable of avoiding animals, but it's also one that is going to have the most tertiary impacts. So it seems to be that this principle of that we should, take no action that's going to lead to harm to other creatures is unsustainable when extended beyond the dinner plate.
Okay. So I'm going to go through, you made a few different points, so I'm going to go through each one. To start off with the appeal to empathy, I don't think that I'm specifically talking about empathy. The reason that I say well-being is good is because I think that pretty much the only moral idea that we can all agree on is that being in pain is bad.
Right? I disagree.
So you disagree. Okay.
There are situations... Pain is a useful system by which we increases our survival because we know that our body is under attack or being disrupted in some way. Many people have practices that involve pain, like tattooing or scarification, that they enjoy. There are sexual practices that involve levels of pain that people find pleasurable and enjoyable. It makes them feel alive. People intentionally induce themselves to pain in order to improve their physicality. We undergo pain in order to work for a living, to provide sustenance for our families. Childbirth involves a great deal of pain. There are many situations in life where pain is part of the process to which achieve other aims that we goal. We tend to deem that unnecessary pain or pain without a useful or moral purpose is pain that is problematic. It's not pain itself that we tend to feel is bad.
Right. Okay. So I'm gonna address that later because I'm gonna make a similar point later. So
okay,
I'll start off with why shouldn't we preserve plants? And the reason for that is that plants are separate from animals and humans in a way that animals aren't separate from humans, because plants don't have a brain. They don't have a central nervous system in the way that animals do. They don't have an amygdala, which allows them to feel strong negative emotions, for example. And
why does that matter?
That means that they are less capable of experiencing well-being or pain than humans and animals are. So I'm going to move on to, you say, for example, growing plants would displace animals, building roads would displace animals, it destroys their habitats, it's bad for them. And I think that's why we have to look to the idea of maximizing well-being. I don't believe in an act-omission distinction. So I think that if you let an animal die by killing it, it would be the same as letting it die by just watching it drown, for example. So when we're looking to maximize well-being, we have to do kind of a cost-benefit analysis. For example, if let's say building roads is bad, well, building roads displaces the habitats of animals, but what benefits does it have for humans? For example, it allows us transportation, which advances our technology. It allows us to increase our own well-being. So each of those is a separate issue that we can debate, but just saying there are harms and therefore we can't do anything doesn't make sense, because we have to look at a comparative notion of maximizing well-being. We can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good by saying, well, any harm is bad. Any harm is bad if it is unjustifiable. But if inflicting harm on one person decreases harm to 100 other people, then I would say that is a moral action. So that's why you say, when you say that pain is good if it lets you accomplish other aims, I agree. That's why we have to have this comparative notion of well-being.
But the comparative notion of well-being leaves us kind of floundering a little bit as to what is justified and what isn't justified, right? So let's say I'm a French chef, right? So cooking is my life. I love milk. I love eggs. I love butter. These are amazing things that make culinary masterpieces that fulfill my life, that bring incredible amounts of pleasure, that are nutritious, and that make my life the best life possible, right? And perhaps I believe, well, in order to minimize pain, I need these things. They're essential for my cooking and for my chefy lifestyle. However, I don't want to cause unnecessary suffering, so I try to source my materials from, the best raised animals, et cetera, et cetera. So he's making some sort of efforts. He's not just sort of ignoring other moral implications, but he is making a decided value that the value of his chefing and his cooking and the food that he provides other people are more important than the imposition of control over the animals and the death of some of those animals in the process. So what's to say in this maximizing happiness and weighing benefits that he's wrong?
Well, that would depend on the harms that are being inflicted to the animals. So if, for example, all of his cooking involves creating meat products like steak all the time, and that's all he does, I would say that the harms created by those would outweigh the benefits that are made to him. Even if he's doing it from maybe like not a factory farm, but a family farm, the harms that I described to animals, my arguments talking about killing them prematurely, for example, still apply. They apply in the same way. So we have to look at, okay.
But why is the cow's life more important than his cooking?
It's not, so the cow isn't more important than he is. But it's not just one cow that he's killing, because if he did that, he'd only be able to make like three products. So he has to kill cows a lot in order to sustain his livelihood of making meat all the time. Sure. And that means that he's negatively affecting a lot more animals than he is being positively affected, because it's just one instance of him who's getting this happiness, for example. And
so, what if millions of salmon die in order to create a hydroelectric dam? Does that, so that we can have some more power, is that bad or good?
That's an interesting one, because the argument that I would have for that is that we should try to advance our society, because the benefit to that is that when we eventually reach an advanced enough level of technology, we'll be able to sustain pretty much any need that anyone has. Once we get to the level where we get all our power from solar energy, we don't have to worry about hydroelectric dams killing fish all the time. We can provide food for everyone, I'm not going to say paradise, but it'll be pretty good, right? So anything that advances us towards that goal is a necessary good. And unless there's some very significant harm that goes against that, then we should be looking to that in order to advance our society. So I would say building hydroelectric dam is good because it gives us electricity, which allows us to advance our technology and our society.
Okay, I think it's a pretty good answer, right? So I don't know that that would necessarily justify veganism per se, but it can justify an underlying ethos that leads a particular individual to veganism, right? So they're saying, I think that these are steps that I can practically take that don't diminish my happiness to such an extent that you're doing good for other animals and creatures that you have some sense of kinship or empathy towards, right? In which case, so if it works for you, like if you think that these are reasonable steps that you could take to benefit others, that would give more benefit to others than you would lose from yourself, then this is a reasonable step for you to take. Does that sound cohesive to you?
Yeah, I think that's the point that I want to make, is the vast majority of people would have no harm inflicted on themselves by going vegan, but they would necessarily benefit other animals by stopping the harm that's being inflicted to them. So as such, most people have a clear moral obligation to go vegan.
Well, see, now here's the thing with a moral obligation, right? Is again, because I feel like because it's based on empathy, right? It's based on an idea of the value that you put on the activities in your life that are based on using animal products versus the value you feel in causing harm to animals and other creatures, right? And for some people, they're going to come to very different conclusions than you will as to the value of those two things. I think that's the difficulty, because if you want to sort of lay a hard line out on what is acceptable and is not acceptable, you have to put some kind of a hierarchy on happiness and contentment and well-being, right? You have to sort of say, well, the life of a creature, the premature death of an animal trumps X, Y, Z, R, like enjoyment of food as an absolute, right? So nobody should be able to do that if you want just a direct formula. Otherwise, you're kind of left giving people an idea, right? Here's a way that you can do a weighing mechanism, but it's still very subjective in the sense that they have to evaluate the value of well-being of one thing versus another thing's well-being for itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think so. First of all, this is like kind of a weird point, but I'm going to say that's what debate is for. I think that
Sure.
One of the purposes of debate is to help us reach better moral frameworks that allow us to act more morally in the world, however we want to define that. So you say that we would have to create a hierarchy of values, like saying, here's number one, here's number two, here's number three. We have to go down there. There are a lot of topics where there are two competing values, and you say, like, should we value someone's fundamental liberty, or should we value someone's lifespan or happiness or something like that? And those are pretty difficult decisions to make. But if you talk about, should we value forcefully impregnating animals over I like to drink milk, that's a pretty obvious instance where for most people, there's no significant harm to them by, for example, switching to almond milk instead, but there's a significant benefit to the cow. So I think in many cases, there are ambiguities. But veganism is not one of those cases, so we don't really have to get into all the instances of trying to rank different moral values.
I guess so. It depends. Like, to me, the value of, I'm aware of how milk is made, right? And I make a moral decision that I'm okay with that. I don't feel as much kinship with the animal kingdom. I feel a sense of competitiveness to some degree, right? Like, I think our nature as human beings, the nature of life, is semi-competitive. We choose cooperative systems for human beings of our own benefit. And we have a natural inborn empathy for other people. We can develop an empathy for other animals, but usually it's those that are most tied to our society, like my pets. They're part of my family in a sense. And so I feel a natural empathy for them as an extension of myself. Same goes for a lot of things. And while I think it's noble to extend human empathy to other animals, I think you can only really take it so far before it becomes somewhat irrational for us and self-destructive in a sense. And while I agree it's perfectly reasonable, you could drink almond milk and enjoy it very much, it still has a lot of impact. Any kind of agriculture and human activity has huge impacts, and I'm not sure that they're actually worse than animal husbandry. I do tend to, and I don't carry it out fully, I do tend to prefer products that I know are raised in an ethical manner. If I can, go to a farmer's market and get something from a farmer who, promises to have relatively ethical processes for his animals, then I would prefer that. But I don't necessarily feel a terrible moral twinge that cows are forcefully impregnated on my behalf. I've seen lots of cows on farms that wander around. They lick the salt lick, they eat the food. They don't seem incredibly distressed. On the other hand, I do have moral problems. Like, I go to a zoo and I see elephants there that are there just for my amusement, but they are clearly unhappy and so forth. And so it's really like my pleasure compared to their unpleasure is, I make that moral weight, and I'm like, yeah, I could do without the elephants here. I think they'd be better off somewhere else, right? They're not doing me much good. I don't think they're all that educational, what they're doing. As where other animals, they'll have some rare wolves in captivity, and they're there because they're trying to breed them and reintroduce them to the wild. And in the meantime, people get to see them, and that helps conservation efforts. I'm like, well, this makes some sense to me. I think that's pretty good on balance, So, I'm always making these balances, and I think for a lot of people, you're like, hey, veal calves are killed at a very young age to provide your veal. And you're like, okay, yeah, well, that's all right. Those are the kinds of judgments some people are going to make, right? It's going to be really hard to sort of reach out to anyone with that viewpoint, and to convince them that there's some immorality or there's some evil involved in it.
Okay, so I don't think that we should draw our moral values from what we empathize with, because it's kind of arbitrary. Like you say that,
but it has to be, because otherwise you'll say, look, I can make that argument. Look, plants are living creatures. They may not have a brain, but they have reactionary systems. They have a will to live, just like any other animal. They have incredibly complex genomes, far more complex than animals. You may not understand the kind of pain and suffering they feel or the kind of degradation that we impose on them, but that doesn't mean it isn't there. Just because you can't sympathize with it doesn't mean it's not real. They're objectively living creatures. They objectively have, in this sense, the same right to life as much as anyone else. They have the same desire to strive as much as anyone else. So why should we, destroy their well-being for our own sustenance?
Yeah. So the issue with that is the same issue that I brought up earlier, which is that plants may experience something similar to pain, but they don't feel it in the same way that animals do, right?
Then why does it matter? I mean, animals maybe don't feel things in exactly the same way we do.
Yeah, but plants don't feel it at all. They it's a response.
That's not true. Plants have responses. I mean, feeling pain. Like I can pinch off a nerve and I won't feel pinpricks to my leg. That doesn't mean my leg isn't being damaged, isn't being attacked. Just because I don't have a sensation of pain in a limb doesn't mean that you can't hurt me, right? I could be totally unaware. I mean, you could say that argument allows for the ethical killing of animals. So long as we anesthetize them first, we can kill them because they're not going to feel any pain or distress, right? Maybe that's something that we would like, but it doesn't eliminate the destruction of well-being that we're applying to them, right?
Okay, so when you talk about there's no pain to me if you numb my leg and then cut it off, I would completely agree with you. That doesn't have an effect on your well-being in the 10 seconds that your leg is being cut off. The reason that I wouldn't say, okay, now let's all cut off people's legs, is because after your leg is cut off, now you only have one leg, and that's not so good for you. Your well-being is going to be negatively affected by that leg being cut off. The issue isn't that your leg was cut off and therefore that's inherently bad. The issue is the effects that arise from that. And I think because plants are unable to experience any of those effects, they don't have the same moral weight that the effects on animals and humans do, because we can feel pain.
I mean,
why not?
If I rip a potato up out of the ground, it dies. That's an effect.
Well, it's an effect. So when I say effect, I'm talking about an effect on specifically your ability to feel pleasure, pain. If you have one leg and you go through your whole life,
right? But once again, we've established that it's not the actual pleasure or pain that is the problem, right?
I wasn't aware of that. We established that. Well,
yeah, you said it was perfectly okay if you cut off somebody's leg if they can't feel it. You're only worried about the consequences later on.
But the consequences are the consequences of pleasure and pain.
Well, the consequence of eating a plant is it's dead.
I know, but that doesn't create pleasure or pain for the plant.
But then we could kill an animal so long as it doesn't suffer any pain?
That's a separate issue. But
why?
Because the animal would have a capacity to feel pleasure or pain in the future.
No, it's gone. I mean, you knocked it out and you wiped it out.
I mean, if you didn't kill it, it would in the future, right? So it had a life ahead of it where it would further be able to experience emotions or. No, the plant is different. We still don't have the point
because
where
you don't understand it.
Because the plant doesn't actually feel pleasure or pain.
No, that's not true.
Point. Okay, why is it true?
Plant. What is pain? Pain is a stimulus response. A thing happens. You register and you have a reaction, right? It's a survival mechanism. Plants have that as well. If you damage a plant in some way, it produces sap to fill in the gap in the wound. It will change its growth patterns. Chemical signals go through the plant to indicate that harm is being done in a location to the plant. The plant's biology responds to that harm in that location by issuing a response of some kind. That's no different in function and purpose than an animal's pain and injury response.
Well, if I have a dead person, let's say I cut off their head and like they're dead, they've been dead for an hour or something.
Okay.
And I touch their hand to a hot stove.
Mm-hmm.
Their nerves will automatically respond and their hand will come away from the stove. But that doesn't mean that they were actually feeling that pain because they're dead. They're unable to experience it because they don't have the brain that's necessary to actually analyze those emotions.
Right, but now you're talking about a higher sense of self-awareness and a meaning ascribed to the physical reaction, in which case a lot of people can argue that many things in the animal kingdom don't have those kinds of responses, don't have a conceptualization of pain or a moral value placed on it, and therefore we shouldn't consider their suffering.
Yeah, so what I'm not arguing about self-awareness. I'm arguing about awareness, period.
Right, but plants do have an awareness. They react to their environment in a meaningful and purposeful way. And so if the sun comes up over here, maybe the leaves will turn in some plants, or they react in a way when the sun is available. They are interacting with their environment. They're responding to stimuli, both negative and positive, in positive and negative ways. It is different in some fashions than the way we do it, as you highlight. But then again, animals react differently than we do to different kinds of stimulus. So, again, what I'm driving at here is that your argument is really not based in a kind of objective observation. It's still based in a kind of empathy. It's a question of how far do you empathize with another living creature. When it comes to plants, you don't empathize at all. When it comes to animals, some people don't empathize at all. But you do empathize with some animals, and others do as well. So there's a range of human empathy that drives these kinds of decisions.
Okay, so first, you say that plants move in response to the sun. I think that's an important point. So I agree with you. Obviously, that's true. But what that doesn't mean is that they actually see the sun and they're moving in response to that.
So I think how is it that they're moving in response to it if they're not aware of it?
So awareness, I think there's an equivocation going on here between two different definitions of awareness. So they're aware in the sense that they are able to respond to it, but they aren't aware in the sense that they experience it consciously, like an animal or a human would if they feel the sun. But we might
argue that a lot of animals don't experience things that way too.
Yeah. Okay. So I would like to continue this conversation, but since we have 2 minutes left, I think this is a never-ending rabbit hole, so I'm going to move on.
Okay.
So I'm going to continue with the idea of empathy, and I think the issue with this, like I said before, is that it's arbitrary. And the issue is I could say something like, I don't empathize with Black people. Does that mean that under my definition, I'm able to treat them the same way I would treat a cow when I'm trying to get its milk? And most people would say no. And what that means is we all implicitly have this feeling that a person's well-being is important. And that's what I'm getting at, is that well-being is the first thing that we should value because it makes sense and it's consistent. So the tree example is one inconsistency. And like I said, we're not going to resolve that here. We don't have enough time. But when we start talking about those inconsistencies, that's how we're going to ultimately reach a moral framework that makes sense. We can't just say, oh, look, here's a problem we haven't solved yet, therefore let's throw out this whole framework. We have to look at the framework and say which one makes more sense. I would say empathy doesn't make sense because it justifies things like racial discrimination, for example.
With racial discrimination, I mean, we can make some rational arguments and we can create a sense of empathy. I mean, that's one of the ways that we generally fight racism is we say, hey, look, you come over here, talk to these people, spend some time with them. And suddenly they will say, well, they're not the crazy weirdos that I thought they were. Maybe they're actually pretty good people. Maybe I shouldn't hurt them anymore, right? It's by engaging people's empathy and by creating a system of I value them the way that I want to be valued, that we change people's moral opinions and we drive that. Because I think fundamentally that is one of the ways that we make those moral decisions. It's one of the ways that veganisms promote veganism, by showing animals and creating empathy.
Okay. So since we have 15 seconds left, I'm just going to close with, if we value well-being, veganism reduces harms to animals, and for most people, there's no significant harm to you, and therefore you guys should all be vegans because it's easy, it's fun, and you'll stop killing animals.